The dispatch spent the better part of a year examining the warrant system around the U.S. We found nearly 6 million warrants that remain unserved today. A chunk of those relate to violent offenses. What's your reaction to that many warrants being unserved?
Well, the problem is that we don't have enough people working warrants. When I was prosecuting attorney in Delaware County, a continuing source of discussion between me and the sheriff and the courts and the county commissioners was to adequately fund the resources for the warrant squad. Now, that being said, the 6 million, I'm going to take you to task just a little bit here. That 6 million number is a little bit unfair. And the reason is an awful lot of those are not violent offenders. They're not people that really pose any kind of a threat. So when you don't show up for a judicial process, since time immemorial, there's been a warrant issued for your arrest, and nobody works it because it just isn't that important. If you get stopped for a traffic violation or have some kind of interaction where that comes up, a background check, then you get brought in and you typically go to the judge and say, yeah, I'm sorry I didn't show up, and you get a new court date and you go on. So it's a way of getting people to actually participate in a process that they're not keen on being part of. Now, but what it does raise with that piece, and we'll come back to the violent thing because I'm very bothered by that, it really raises the question of whether we ought to be using arrest warrants to force people to be part of a process. I favor increased use of collateral sanctions. If you don't show up for a traffic case, I really don't want you arrested. We've got enough people in jail. We don't have enough cops. We don't have enough jail beds. Let's cancel your license, and sooner or later you're going to get stopped. Try to renew your license plates, or your insurance company's going to send you a letter, and that's going to get your attention. It just doesn't make sense to me that we have arrest warrants for that purpose. Now, that being said, the fact of violent offenders, and those can be misdemeanors too, right? What if you've got a domestic violence, or you've got an assault out there? I don't want to say that those misdemeanors shouldn't be worked either. But we need to triage these and pay attention to the things that are most important. And I think there's some things that we can do in that regard.
What kind of things would you do to triage that? What are some practices that that agencies could use to sort of focus in on the ones that really matter?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that's going to happen January 15th. The Attorney General's office is going to rejoin the fugitive task forces run out of the United States Marshal's offices. I don't know if you've talked with Pete Elliott. Pete's had tremendous success with it, working interagency, and we're going to become part of that. Rather than reinvent the wheel, let's take what's already working and make it stronger. In addition to that, I think that we can, and I will, test the data in the lead system. I have anecdotal reason to believe that there are warrants that aren't making it into leads, so we stop people and
we have
don't
hard
know.
evidence. Yeah, we have hard evidence that especially those misdemeanor violent offenses that you referenced, those are not being entered.
Or not always.
Or not always, but the majority of those are not making it in. Certainly here in Franklin County, and we suspect it's in other areas too. So if I'm picked up for a domestic violence offense here in, I have a warrant in Franklin County, and I'm stopped for traffic in, say, Huron County, the patrol officer wouldn't know.
Well, we need to not just know that that's happening, because I said the anecdotal evidence shows that it is. What we need to do is look at where are the failures in the pipeline. Where are the leaks occurring, where it doesn't get into leads. And once we know that, we can design some solutions to bolster that, to shore it up. And that's something the Attorney General can and should be part of.
Michigan has a law that requires all warrants to be entered into the LEAD system. Would you support something like that here in Ohio?
Well, sure, but what good is a law if it's not enforced?
Okay.
I mean, we already have laws, for example, that require certain kinds of entry into the firearms database, right? And we know that there are people that don't get there that ought to be, sometimes with tragic consequences. So a law is great, but let's not mistake passing a law for being the same thing as taking action and fixing a problem.
Just this morning, I was running some numbers on drug warrants, essentially in the state of Ohio. It's close to 50. It was close to 50,000 in our data. We just had issue 1 where people are talking about trying to pull some of the pressure off of that and make it less of a arrestable or jailable crime. When you're trying to find ways to make things more efficient, is that a place where you would look for change, in which essentially making drug possession or the more minor drug crimes that we're seeing thousands of in here?
The problem with that is it's not smart enough. An F4 violation, 292511 for heroin, might be 45 balloons possession. You would classify that in your data work as a nonviolent possession drug offense. If you got 45 balloons of heroin, you're a drug dealer. Whether we saw you hand to hand taking money for drugs or not, no simple addict walks around with that kind of weight on them. So I don't think we can just take a chainsaw to the data and say, okay, this stuff is out. A drug dealer is doing significant harm to our society, our communities. I want them off the street. Now, what I think might make more sense is to do this from the bottom up. Who knows the most? If you got this panoply, thousands of violent offenders, who knows who the worst ones are? Because a lot of them, while they're classified as an offense of violence, may not, in fact, be all that bad of an issue. A burglary is an offense of violence. I'm not sure that some guy that did a low-level burg during the day because he broke into somebody's porch and took their lawnmower is something that we ought to spend a huge amount of effort trying to find, right? You see what I mean? Even though, again, cut with the chainsaw and just look at the offense, you're going to say, oh, it's an offense of violence. We got to go look at that person. Who knows who we really need to get? Who knows who the dangerous dudes are? The cops on the beat, the detectives that work these cases. So maybe the way we deal with this is to allow a most wanted list that's generated by the grassroots, so that you've got a case where you've got somebody that you know is especially dangerous, that you get to use a dedicated law enforcement communication channel to say, this is one we need to put up at the top.
We asked almost everyone involved in the criminal justice system here in Franklin County and beyond this simple question that if you took the same data that we had and you identified hypothetically the 50 most violent suspects on this list, and you met every 6 months or a year or somewhere in that neighborhood, wouldn't that be a good thing? And everyone to a person said, yeah, that would, in fact, the sheriff's department's like, we should start doing that next week. But I think what it comes down to is
I'll give you a different answer. It's a terrible idea. We don't need another meeting.
Okay.
How are you going to get all those people together? How are you going to decide? So the underlying idea, shouldn't we be talking about this and triaging it for the most important? That's a good idea. I'm for that. I'm not for another meeting. How would we even organize that? Who comes? How do we pay for the people that are off duty? Let's use technology. We can use either old school stuff like email, or we could use what if we built an app like Facebook that was law enforcement password protected, and we used that to kind of do a wiki assessment. That makes sense, and it can be real time. We don't have to wait for 6 months. One of the points in your series was the longer it goes, the harder it is. And that, I'll tell you from experience being a prosecutor, that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
The curve goes like this with every passing day. If you've got real-time interaction across law enforcement, and we've got good information and leads, and we're triaging these things to look for the worst of the worst, we're going to dramatically increase our apprehension rate, which is what we ought to want.
But it sounds like it's a leadership issue, though, that someone needs to step up and organize something like you just described. Is the AG's office the entity that could take the lead on something like that?
Look, we've got a tradition in Ohio of local law enforcement. Prosecutions start at the county level. The Attorney General, with a few exceptions, doesn't start prosecutions. With a few exceptions, the Attorney General's office doesn't start investigations. So I think the Attorney General's office can facilitate, but ultimately this has got to be local law enforcement leading. They're the ones that know the details. They're the ones that have the expertise. And I look forward to working with them to see how I can help them to fashion the solution to this.